Welcome back to the channel. Today I'm joined by Bas van Os, expert on historical Jesus and also Gnosticism. And Gnosticism is a term that is very popular, used all the time, often gets a bad rep. Um, it's interesting to a lot of people. I mean, the occults often play with it in a fun way, like a positive way. I think there's a good reason that people are a bit suspicious of it. And I do think there's bad sides to it, but at the same time, I don't hear a lot of the positive sides being discussed on this side of the internet. And yeah, I think, Boss, you know a lot about Gnosticism and you also value it for many different reasons, and I do as well, because of the Gnostic texts that we've discussed together. And the way I'd like to start this conversation today is that you basically, from just the foundation, explain what Gnosticism actually is, and then we'll go from there.
Okay, so it's the first thing to say, it's a hotly debated term.
Oh, okay, that's fun. I love those.
Okay, so
Those are my
so we
favorite
have
terms.
I have about I don't know, about 15 books about what can we do with the term. Isn't it highly problematic, and should we still use it?
Yeah, I know
So
a couple of terms like that.
yeah, so let me take the most positive term first. That would be to be in a state of participatory knowing with the divine. That's a positive term.
That's a lot there, though. Can you explain participatory knowing in this context?
If you go into the Bible and you read the original Hebrew, when people have sex, then they don't use the word they have sex.
Yeah,
They use the word they knew each other. Abraham knew his wife and she got pregnant.
yeah,
So it's an intimate type of knowing. Um, when you go into the Gospel of John, the life eternal is described as to know God the Father and Jesus whom he sent. So to know God, that means in a personal relationship. Could even be evangelical. To be in a personal relationship, to be in a empathetic relationship with Christ, with God, that would be to know one, and that would be fruitful. So in that sense, to be a Gnostic would be to know God intimately. That's a very positive term. It's the term also that Clement of Alexandria, that's a Christian teacher from year 200 in Alexandria, still uses. So he doesn't want these non-mainstream Christian groups to sort of monopolize the term. So he calls himself a Gnostic. He's got this beautiful booklet on the prayer of the Gnostic. It's in the Stromatheis. His and it's beautiful. So to know God changes you, changes how you live, changes how you think, makes a huge difference. And in that sense, to be Gnostic is to be a Christian. But you could also say, if you go into the Corpus Hermeticum, that's Egyptian corpus, there's also this idea that you, in a Neoplatonic way or in a Middle Platonic way, can be part of the divine. To be, if you go into readers of Plato, but also Philo, you can say you can, at one point, you can actually have this anagoga, that's the term that John Vervaeke uses, to be part of the world of the intellect, that you see the forms, that you become in awe of that other world. It's a sort of a philosophical way of going above this world of matter. Now, all of that would be a positive way of saying what it is to be a Gnostic. We will narrow it down to some pretty negative stuff as well later on. But let's first start with the obvious. It's to know God.
That's good.
Yeah.
Okay, so does it go from positive directly to negative? Is there a neutral ground? Like, where are we?
Okay, so next step, that would be somewhat problematic is that it's basically, is this world where we live, is it a bad place? Will it end? What
Yeah.
have you?
Yeah.
So we have the big question is, where does all the suffering and where does all the injustice come from? Now, in essence, Neoplatonism doesn't work with that. There's a little bit of the cave, the allegory of the cave in Plato that says this is a limited world and it would be better if you're on the outside, and you feel that it's better to be on the outside. But the idea that this is a really bad place and there's a lot of suffering that you need to come out, you see that in Buddhism, but you don't see that much in Neoplatonism. So the biggest critique that Plotinus and Porphyry have on both Gnostics and Christians is that they have a negative attitude of this world, and they even say, that's really weird in the eyes of Plotinus and Porphyry, that this world will have a beginning and an end. Because if it's perfect, it's of course eternal. This is an interesting moment in time, that when the Catholic priest Lemaitre came up with the idea of the Big Bang, all of the philosophically inclined physicists said, well, you can't do that. This universe has to be eternal. It's Catholic bullshit to have a creatio ex nihilo. So the Big Bang was, by the scientists of the day, was ruled out. That was Catholic bullshit, could not have happened. A bit like that, Plotinus and Porphyry would say, that Christian bullshit, that Gnostic bullshit, that the world was created and will end, that's so unphilosophical, that takes away something of the eternity of creation and of God's presence in creation.
That I understand, but do you think that Plotinus and Porphyry understood this material reality to be eternal?
Yes.
So they would see even like the Earth as a planet to be eternal. Okay. Clear.
Yeah. So basically, they have a good and almost divine characteristic of creation. So you've got the one in Plotinus. The one is, of course, the one. It's eternal, so it doesn't think. It's not aware. It's the one. In order to think, you have to pass thoughts. So you need to have the passing of time. You get that. So only below, emanated from the one, is the intellect, the nous. And when you get to the intellect, then you can have the forms. Then you can think of things. Forms, not things, sorry. So you can think. Yeah. And then out of that intellect emanates the soul, the world soul, and also the eternal soul in human beings. This is a very Greek thing, this eternal soul of human beings, that is part of that world soul. And that is almost where the production starts. And then you get the physical world. And there is not a bad disconnect in that whole string of emanations to when you get from the one to the many. That's of course.
But is there also no hierarchy?
There is a hierarchy. The one is better than the many.
Yeah. Okay.
So they need to explain, even though they don't call it bad, because it's all the will of God. It's all driven by the one.
Yeah.
So it can only be good. But nevertheless, the many is less divine than the one.
Yeah. Okay. But that's a bit of a tricky one then. It's a bit of like...
this is, we're dealing with reality here. If Plotinus would know that the world was in fact from a big bang and will end in a conflagration, he would have to adjust his philosophy.
Yeah, but would he though? Like, because okay, I understand what you mean, but
it takes away one of the divine elements of creation.
Yeah, okay. But so what you're telling me is actually that Plotinus was operating under an assumption, like the eternal reality of the earth is just something you wouldn't even question. It's just something that's like, it was so made.
It's so stupid to think otherwise.
Yeah, okay. Then then that makes sense. But he would not be like, there's a good chance he would be intellectually honest enough to adjust, and that would
Of
actually not.
course, no,
Yeah.
no, no, he's a good guy.
Yeah. Nice guy.
He's a good guy. He can think. He loves the truth, etc.
Yeah.
So it's a good guy.
Cool.
But then you get the Christians or the Jews who say, well, God created this earth good, but we made a mess of it. So there is chaos, there is a sin, there is people not behaving according to the will of God. You could even say there's chance behavior when you get storms and fires, etc. So we have a sense of what is supposed to be good, and we say it's not good. And how did that happen? Well, because creation strayed away from its pure and good origins. That's the Jewish Christian
Yeah.
idea. Now the Gnostic Christians, they had a nasty turn in there because, and I'll explain later on how that may have happened, but we don't know. But the key thing that we observe is that the turn from good to bad didn't happen in the material world, in humanity, but it happened in the intellectual world. It says basically there are two types of wisdom. One is the wisdom that completely contemplates the one. That's completely the good wisdom. That's the wisdom that is upward. And then there's the wisdom that turns into herself, and because of that shadow is able to make something less perfect than the one. Because we still have to explain how the one became many, or how perfect good became this world as we observe it today.
Yeah.
And they decided, and that's a very interesting turn, they decided not to blame humans for that, but to blame the material world, creation, corruptibility for that.
But
So
so
they
then
put it in a divine level.
in part also humans, but the lower parts of humans, let's say, if you use that language, like the material side to us.
No, 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 no. It's actually the divine, but the lower part of the divine. So they would call this. Remember Plotinus. You've got the one, the intellect, the psyche, the
Yeah.
soul. They would say that the demiurge, Plato's demiurge, is basically soul, and that the soul is already at a level that it's somewhat ignorant of the one, and that it sort of becomes arrogant if it sees itself as the one. And now we get to a point that many people may recognize. It was the time of the big Roman Jewish wars. So you had the war of 66, 73, in which Jerusalem was burned down and the temple was destroyed. And then you had the Kitos War, which was 115, 117. It's a big war as well, much related to the conquest by the Romans of the Parthian Empire. And then you had the big uprising, 133, 135, the Bar Kokhba revolution in
Yep.
Israel. And those three wars resulted also in a lot of deaths in Egypt, on Cyprus, in Syria, where Jewish populations would take up arms and destroy pagan temples, or there is a letter from Egypt that is preserved that says, "My son, I haven't heard from you for so long now. I hope the Jews didn't get you."
I know this one. Yeah, I've seen it. Yeah.
So that is a period in which the God of the Jews, almost like Israel now, gets a bad rep.
Yeah.
And it's difficult for people to see in the God of Genesis that selects Israel as its sole inheritance and it's the covenant people as a wise God, as a good God. They said that's not what Jesus could have meant. They said, well, the father of Jesus, the father God of Jesus must be above. And then, hey, look here, Plato has this demiurge. Why cannot we assume that the God of Genesis is this lower level demiurge? And different from Neoplatonism, that demiurge would be less good, not just lower in from the one to the many,
No,
less
that's a
divine, but it would also be less
persuasive.
good.
It's a persuasive argument if you tie it to war and violence.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's where I think this turn came from.
Yeah.
And now we get to some nasty stuff because this sort of feeds into Christian anti-Semitism. And in the Christian church, fortunately, they kept the Old Testament, but there was a huge debate going on. Should we keep that or not? But also, it turns into a negation of the material world as something inherently corrupt because it's created by a corrupted divine power. The demiurge is a corrupted divine power. Depending on the writing that you read, it's either stupid or it's really bad. It's either hubristic or it's really out there to enslave people. And so they would see normal religion as a way to enslave people, to keep people in those certain servitude roles. It's very much like wokeism today. They would see religion as means how the gods want to keep people and make them their slaves so that they would worship the gods and would serve the gods, but they don't know the perfect will. They're stuck in this psychic realm, not the spiritual realm. And it's the idea that in this realm we are stuck and we do not know the real and true God. So the Gnostic would see themselves as the ones that pierced through the heavens and saw beyond the heavens and saw the Father of Jesus and came to the one of Neoplatonism. And thus they had knowledge that other people didn't have, because if ordinary Christians like you and me would think of God, we would think of the God of Genesis. And they would say, that's the wrong God. There's a God above it. So, and we are privileged to know the true God and Father of Jesus.
Yeah, or let's say we would absolutize an image of God that we picked up through what we learned and we misunderstand.
Yeah, we talked about Meister Eckhart last time, and I said,
Yeah,
how can you become a virgin? By letting go of all your preconceptions of God and then let him be born in you.
yeah.
They would say that the Jewish preconceptions of God would prevent you from getting to know the true God.
Mm.
And that's an interesting thing. And I think it's partly correct that we have conceptions of God that are simply idolatrous.
Yeah, especially applied to the modern day.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So there's some nasty stuff in there, and there is, and they tend to make it, because this then leads to, say, privileged knowledge, and then they
Yep.
say, well, these Gnostics are narcissistic because they think they're better than the rest. I don't think it. I mean, that's what the church fathers do say about them.
Yeah.
Let's be honest about it. It's what they do say about them. But I think that they would be very happy if everybody would know this purely loving God, purely God who is at rest, who is not in the passing of time, who's etc., who is becoming to that level of nous and then the one.
This sounds to me like the psychonauts, the psychedelics, and the enthusiasts who are like, I've seen something, but
Yeah,
they often they want to share in it, but then there's also this element of narcissism.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. So it's almost as if they're normal people, just like any other group of people.
Yeah. Okay. Is that enough you want to say about Gnostics to introduce them to make them understandable to us? I'll ask you actually a question before we continue. Um, from what I understand, Gnostics aren't just Christians. Gnostics are they possibly related to different religions? Can you elaborate a bit on that?
Well, if I take that first definition,
Yeah, okay.
knowing the true sacred, the true divine, then you can brush a lot of spiritualities under that header, and then you've got Gnostics all over the place.
Yes.
If I make it the ones who denounce the God of Genesis, and then one of the proposals is not to call that Gnosticism anymore, but to call it, let's not careful now, biblical demiurgialism. So it's the demiurge
Yeah.
of the Bible that is denounced.
Yeah.
Okay, so you can go various ways. I would normally say Gnostic Christians.
And then
That's the field that I study.
that makes sense. And then were these people explicitly Gnostic? Did they call themselves the Gnostics? Well,
Some of them did, most of them didn't. We tend to give them names in accordance with the teachers that first Irenaeus, one of the church fathers in the 2nd century,
Yeah.
up until Epiphanius in the 4th century, they would say, well, it's this teacher, so they are Valentinians because they follow Valentinus,
Yeah.
or they are Heracleonites because they follow Heracleon, or Ptolemaeus. And that's a way that the Gnostics would not like it, because they would not say that they would follow a human teacher. They would say, we know the true God and Father of Jesus.
Yeah. Okay. I feel that today maybe we have a wave of reverse Gnostics in a way. And what I mean by that is that people maybe they have this idolatry with just the material and then they forget about the opposite side. Would that be a fair thing to say?
Yeah, yeah. If you get the best of people, people's spirituality, then there is a good appreciation of both the material world and the spiritual world, or the spiritual realm, because we are humans. This is what defines us as humans: is that we can travel in the spirit.
Yeah.
I can be empathetic to someone on the other side of this earth, or 1,000 years in distance from me. So that's crazy. That's incredible.
Yeah.
And that specific human potential. And I'm, of course, a little bit biased because I think the Gospel of Philip is a great work that has actually this balance. So even though it is written in the sense that the normal Christians are wrong, they are idolatrous because they serve this demiurge, and their misconceptions of what church would be, or what God would be, or what the resurrection would be, it still has some of the most beautiful Neoplatonic descriptions of how truth is the one, but she became many for us in order to teach us lovingly about the one. That's a beautiful one. Or when you go to the end, it says the other realm and this realm have become one. We're both in heaven and in this material world at the same time. It's the complete integration of the two realms, the two spheres. And I think that integration is something that is in that text from the Gospel of John. Eternal life is that you know God and Jesus, whom he sent. And that means something like it starts now. It's in knowing God that you have become part of this eternal life. That abundance, that relationship in John is also very much present in the Gospel of Philip. It's just that I don't like it when they denounce the God of Genesis, when they denounce the Jews, when that's when they denounce the normal churchgoers like me. Like
Yeah.
you're completely ignorant if you still stick to the God of Genesis.
Yeah. But what is your rebuttal to that actually? If you really had to like debate a Gnostic or speak with them and try to illuminate.
It's the presupposition that we just spoke about, that bad stuff happened in the divine realm. I would say no, it happens in our conception of the divine realm. So I would not make it a divine emanation that this material world has come from. By the way, they are highly mythical. So they would read all stories in the New Testament, Old Testament, in a mythical sense that they could allegorize, very much like the Greeks had started to read the Homeric literature in a mythical sense, in order to tease out timeless messages. This started to happen also in Alexandria among the Jews. Philo of Alexandria comes to mind, with the Bible, and they would feel free to actually replace those myths. So a lot of the Christian Gnostic texts that we read today are rewritings of gospel stories and of creation myths in order to make a different point. So the rebuttal that I would make is, sorry guys, I love this God, I love this world, I love this creation, I love my body. Oh boy, I love my body, and and I'm grateful that that I received this body, and I'm grateful that God sees this world as part of a creation that is good. But I'm aware of sin in this creation. I'm aware of corruption, and I'm aware that renewal is required. Yeah, I'm aware of that. So I'm also aware. Basically, I'm the Christian.
Beautiful. So when you hear people speak about Gnosticism, because we mentioned that oftentimes there's a bit of a, I don't know, a derogatory sense in which Gnosticism gets discussed.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, how do you respond to that? That's something that I definitely come across a lot, whereas a lot of people also don't really know exactly what they mean
Well, that's the weirdest,
Gnosticism.
actually, because a lot of stuff that's happening in the corner, that's happening with Vervaeke, that's happening with Peterson. Um, I've read all that stuff already in that Gnostic Christian literature. There's part of it that I don't like, but a lot of it is already engaging with this Neoplatonic thinking in a very deep level. And by just discarding it rather than taking it seriously, we're trying to do it all over again. We're trying to sort of invent the wheel again,
Okay, so
rather than.
let's get precise. What is this stuff about Vervaeke and Peterson? What are they trying to do that's already been done, let's say?
Um, I think Vervaeke more so than Peterson has Neoplatonism as this Silk Road, this way of connecting spiritual traditions. Because the moment, remember emanation from the one to the many. The
Yeah.
moment that you go a little bit up, you can start connecting stuff. Some of the Gnostics did this also. When, for instance, gods like Mars and Aphrodite become psychological factors. I think a lot of this is happening actually in the symbolic world group as well. So using they're using terms in, and they're not just materialists. So when in the symbolic world they're talking about egregores and stuff like that, that's very similar to spirits and demons and what have you in Gnosticism, early Christianity, etc. Um, so yeah, I think there is there are a lot of parallels to observe. Some of them are useful, some of them are helpful, some of them are not. So you do have to know your way around. I think there's a weird stuff that the Dan Brown, the whole Dan Brown thing. You know the Da Vinci Code and the Dan Brown as the author of the Da Vinci Code, and then he he sort of presents the Gnostic Gospels as describing a purely human Jesus, having a human father and mother, especially the Gospel of Philip. And it couldn't be farther from the truth. Jesus is less human. He is, in the Gospel of Judas, he's able to ascend anytime to this other realm. The only difference is that they do not much care for a physical resurrection. So the resurrection is extremely important, but the physical resurrection is not that important. Not that important, is not important at all to them.
It sounds quite meta modern.
It's almost, yeah, that's why you see it again. Now, interesting. If you go into the Gospel of Philip, now redemption, remember, there's three ways there to talk about redemption. One is the temporal dimension. The future will be better than today.
Yeah.
The coming of the kingdom of God. One is the spatial dimension, which you very much see also in Greek philosophy of the time. If you go to Heraclides, if you go to Plutarch, you see this idea that the true and the wisest souls can actually ascend to heaven. I even in a Dutch popular program they said, yeah, she doesn't know that her father has become a little star in heaven. Well, that's Greek. That is there. It's moving up. So you've got the spatial dimension of delivery. So you go out of this sphere that is ruled by the lower gods, and you come into the realm of the Father of Jesus. And then and that's an interesting one, Then you've got the psychological dimension, because at one point the Gospel of Philip says they talk about the one above and the one above the one above. So you've got God and etc. But I would rather say the one inside and the one inside the one inside. So you find out who you are on the inside, and then you find out that beyond that is even the spiritual or the divine spark in there. That's a lot about sacred self and stuff there. And it is able to play with all these three dimensions of redemption without actually saying, well, you need to stick to this temporal, this spatial, or this psychological interpretation. They don't care that much.
When we're talking about reinventing the wheel, do you think it's an unnecessary effort in that sense, the way we spoke about it? Do you think there's a better way to do it, to just
No. It's a very useful effort. I think it's very good. I think we'll make some of the same mistakes as those that people made in antiquity. So it's always fun to take this historical perspective and see how people will react to each other in sometimes similar ways as what happened then.
Yeah.
And I think especially the response to Israel's wars at the moment, the response to wokeness, etc. The woke is actually, it's almost gnosis. Huh?
Yeah.
In a lot of these older texts, it's about awakening. It's about coming out of your sleep. And this is also, once you see systemic racism and later on the intersectionality is added to it, once you see it everywhere.
Yeah.
It's almost like waking up to another reality and to another story, another narrative that sort of explains the pattern of reality. And I think it's as a historian, historical Jesus, early church, the study of Gnosticism is actually a very interesting object of study, and I think very worthwhile, because as soon as you start to understand people as people, rather than saying I'm reading these texts to fight against them, then you probably also would fight against people today who have these kinds of ideas. Whereas you could also come into conversation with them, with these texts, with these people, as you could come into conversation with people today.
Yeah. You've listened a lot to John Vervaeke specifically. What do you wish for him? A lot of
Uh-huh.
people, so a lot of people, they will listen to him and they're Christian. They're like, I wish John would become a Christian. Other people maybe are happy with where John is at the moment. Are there things that you would wish he could see better, whether that would lead into a religious conversion or not? Is there anything there that you'd like to see?
Okay, I'm not that. I'm the term Christianity in Dutch is Christendom, which means Christian stupid. If you take it literally, it's not an etymological thing. It's just Christen and Dom, stupid.
Um,
So it's just how it sounds. Christentum in German. But then we have got the D, so in German it would be Christendom. And I believe something of the wish that we would recruit people for our specific idolatry. I don't think that's a very good wish. Also, if I would have a community and he would be in town, I would love him to join my church. You get what I mean? But
yeah,
I understand my church as a very limited expression of how to serve God properly. But if that's the expression in our town, little town, and I would love to have him there and share with us his conceptions and him sharing in our stories, etc. So I'd love to be in community with him. And in my little town, that would probably be the church community, because I don't know that many places here that do this other than the churches, if you get what I mean.
yeah,
In terms of the conception of God, I think John is doing marvelous stuff with his embodying the sage. So or do I say it correctly if I say embodying the sage?
internalizing the sage.
Yeah, but he has got this Socrates in him, his diamond in him, he's
Yeah,
got Jesus in him.
it's internalizing.
And I think that's a way, that's a very in the psychology of religion, it's a very healthy way, as long as you select healthy teachers. I think him selecting Socrates and Jesus is a pretty good selection. But there is something peculiar about Jesus that I really love, and that I would without saying to someone you cannot internalize Muhammad or you cannot internalize. I'm not that kind of Christian, but I am so much in love with who Jesus is that I do wish that for everyone, and for me, Jesus is the one who shows God as the one who loves you. This is why the first letter of John, the end of the New Testament, ends with God is love. That idea that is so profound, that God is love itself. I remember your brother saying, maybe I should not, maybe he should be saying these things himself. But if you discuss loving God or loving your neighbor, then people say, well, is that in an idolatry setting, you would love God at the expense of your neighbor. So you would
Yeah.
put an inquisition there, you would start pushing on people, you have to believe this, you have to behave like this, etc. But once you discover God not as an object to be loved, but as love itself,
Yeah. Yeah.
then it fuels the love of the neighbor in the most pure and perfect way possible.
Yes. Yeah.
Now, Jesus did this by offering to people the way that you could speak about God, could relate to God as with a loving father, well knowing that there were very many orphans in those days, that there were very many authoritarian fathers. Huh? So that's not the point. But he knows that there is something in us that is touched if you have a loving father. And he offers this as a model of dealing with God. That's why we call him the Son of God, because God became a father when he got a son. And then he said, you're my brother. So we become children of God. And weird things happen from that point onward. And the psychology of religion actually shows that people who have a personal relationship with a loving God, as opposed to people have a questioned relationship to a impersonal divine, or people who have a fearful relationship with a judgmental God, there are huge differences in health benefits. And I think that the model that Jesus gave to us is a very healthy model. And it did something that Tom Holland found out, is it shaped our perception of the other. Because if our perception of the other is from a materialist world, then the other is simply the other. There's no relationship. If it's from a judgmental God, then a king of the world, we need to sort of impose God's will on the other, or on God's behalf punish the other. But if God's a loving father and there's a prodigal son, then Jesus says, and there's an older son and a younger son, but Jesus is the son who came from the father to go to the sons who are outside. So he's a third son. He goes there and he explains what kind of father it is that is waiting with arms open wide for this son to return. I have no way anymore to denounce or be judgmental to other people. That's why I think Christendom is really dumb. We need to follow Jesus, because Jesus takes away from us the possibility of being judgmental towards others. Because if we want to love God, who is love, and who loves all his lost sons and daughters, and we start shitting on them, judging them, etc., God's not going to be happy. What father would be happy if you shit on his son? No father. I mean, that's the whole conception that all people are created equally and have a dignity and are desired and wanted beings who are loved by the one that you love the most, love itself, God. That changes the way that you look at your enemies, and you start to understand why Jesus says, love your enemies. Because there's so much to be gained. And I don't think Christianity in particular has been a good student of Jesus. So would I want John to join my church? Yes, if that means that that's the place where we have communion with each other and where he can bring his ideas and where we can share the myths and share in the sacrificial ritual that shows the love of Jesus, but not in a sense that he would have to be recruited for my personal idolatry.
It's a good answer. There's two answers there that you give just now with your conclusion. Is there anything in between that, I mean, there is a, let's say, a power in my experience to saying explicitly or to, I think John already acts in this way. Um,
Yes.
then that's to me the most important thing, which is why like I don't know if it's a good thing or a bad thing if he becomes an explicit Christian, because to me he's actually perhaps making more of an impact by not being it. Um, but sometimes I wonder where the line really is, because to me he's one of the most Christian people I've ever interacted with. Uh,
If you listen to his explanation of
yeah, it's
agape
amazing.
love, I
It's
mean, he
amazing.
he gets it.
He gets it, and then sometimes I hear, well, almost every conversation that I listen to him, he speaks about not being a Christian or not going there, and I just wonder. Yeah, it's for me, it's no longer a thing of like, oh, I want him to. It's for me of like I'm trying to understand deeply what is what is truly keeping him, um, and whether that's good or whether that's like a psychological thing. I That's something that I do think a lot about him, and I truly wish him the best, and I see him as one of the most um, impactful thinkers.
I think he has a lot of the best already. I think he can
Yeah,
share from his spirituality with us things that we can learn about God.
yeah,
What I think, why I can be not by elevating myself above him, but by being sympathetic to him. I do remember how he reacted to his time in this Eastern Orthodox
yeah,
monastery, I believe, or
yeah.
hermitage.
I think it was him.
Uh, and that had stirred something within him. And I think that is something that got something that got perverted in his youth
Yeah,
by judgmentalism, by fundamentalism that becomes judgmental, and that has hurt him a lot. And still, even though it has hurt him, it's like I don't want to judge his parents or his church where he came from. That may have been done all with the best intentions. But for John, it was traumatic, as he sometimes explains. And it's almost like being in a situation where you see an abused child in an abusive home, still attached to wishing that it would be a good home. And if anything, if you say, is there something that you would wish for him, then it would be that the trauma, he makes it productive. So nothing wrong with that, but that the trauma would actually be cured and that he could, um, without any retenance, any retention, I should perhaps say, or reluctance, that he could simply enjoy being part of the Christian family and being part of worshipping God without necessarily having to define him as being restricted to the Christian tradition. Because I think it's marvelous what he teases out of all these other traditions and of science that he brings to it. Because that's in the end what we're doing. We're trying to be be in gnosis. Let's go back to that word, to know God, to know something of that divine that is truly um, yeah, wonderful to be part of. And I'm not doing that in this escapist way that I want to escape this
yeah,
reality. No, it imbues this reality with a glory and a beauty that is beyond description. And I would wish that for so many people, but
yeah.
I don't think John doesn't have it.
Okay, but then I want to ask you a concrete question, because you go to Protestant church,
Yeah.
and Um, that's also similar to the Gnostics. Protestants get a lot of, well, let's be real, shit thrown at them in this little corner of the internet. And Orthodoxy is on the rise. And, well, there is a tangible exclusivity to Orthodoxy. And, you know, when I hear you speak and when we're talking about Vervaeke and about yourself in that sense, I do think about that where a lot of people coming from perhaps more Orthodox circles or people that are maybe more hardline Christian are like, well, your soul is not saved unless you perform certain rituals and you do certain things. And
Yeah.
how do you think about that?
Well, I always say baptism. The Baptist churches got created in the 16th century, even though they think they go back to the first century. But so basically, you're a product of the time that you were born in. The Orthodox churches were pretty much born in the time that we moved out of the house churches and into the more formal churches around 200, 300, 400. I mean, even the clothes they're wearing are still the clothes that you could see at Constantine's court. The connection between Orthodoxy and a nation state, for instance, is something that was born at that point in time. Um, I think we can have a discussion with the Orthodox churches about what is more marvelous and wonderful about what they've learned from Jesus and how they maintain the mysticism that is connected to dealing with the divine, how they have integrated Neoplatonism with the Jewish Christian tradition in a wonderful way. I mean, I only have respect for that. But not recognizing that even your church, your beautiful church, is a temporal expression, a human creation, um, conventions of humans, populated by people with limitations, that would be to misplace the divine and the material again, because you would think that this is the divine. It's not. It's a reflection of the divine. We've reconfigured the material here in a way that it reflects as much as possible what we've learned from the divine, or basically what people in the 3rd and 4th century learned from the divine. And I think it's done in a marvelous way. But um, don't mistake it. Don't make it Christendom.
Yeah. And so that's why for you, it's like, you got a house where you live right now and you went to the closest church and you're like, this is going to be my community. And
Well, we went to South Africa when we early in my career,
mhm,
when apartheid ended, and we wanted to join a church there that was alive, that was faithful, that was mixed race, that everybody got a chance at the leadership, etc. And we couldn't find that perfect church, and we kept moving churches. And that sometimes it's good to put down roots. And I think if you put down roots in an Orthodox church, you're making an excellent choice. If you put down roots in a Baptist church, you're making an excellent choice. As long as you do not, and this is what I've learned perhaps from these Gnostics, as soon as you allow the church structures to become these oppressive structures and to become idolatrous structures that stand in the way of letting God happen in your life, then I think as long as you don't do that, then there is a beauty in the humility of submitting to an existing tradition and allowing that in the Orthodox Church you would have a confessor father that would guide you, that you would have certain rules that limit yourself, not because you are unfree, but because you freely give yourself and limit yourself, and to fully benefit from the communion and the community with God and his people that could be yielded by that.
yeah, I think it's a beautiful way to think about it. And I think it's also a way to not let it infinitely um, digress. Like because you start to think about, okay, what is a church and what isn't a church, and like if everything's okay, then nothing's okay, type of thing. But you do actually draw a line in the sense that not having the oppressive structure, letting God be present. I mean, there's specific conditions, maybe not highly perfectionist specific conditions, but there are specific conditions to make.
Well, you make it the oppressive structure. The Gospel of Philip, this Gnostic text, actually helps us to understand that forms and images, as they call, as that text calls it, are of this world. They're of this limitation. Nevertheless, they're necessary in order to enter the other
Yeah,
realm.
yeah,
And that thinking, that rituals and forms in the way that we speak, as long as we use them in a liberated way, in a humble way, then it's beautiful. As soon as it becomes an oppressive structure that divides people from each other, you're not following my oppressive structure, my idolatry, so you're not part of God. As soon as that happens, then we lose sight of who God truly is.
yeah, yeah,
And that and then the Lord is not born in you, as Eckhart would say.
yeah. Well, we're pretty much over time. I'm really happy with where all of this went, and I still have a lot of questions for you. Fortunately, we do have this relationship of father and son as well, so
Yep.
I'll get many opportunities to do that. Before we finish, anything you want to close with? Any last thoughts that you have lingering?
No, no, no. You lead, and I'm happy to follow your construction, your limited
My oppressive
construction,
structure.
your expressive structure, and to
Structure.
submit myself humbly to your leadership, my son.
Of course. Well, thank you for talking. And if people in the comments have thoughts and ideas, I'd love to hear them. And we'll see you for the next one. Thank you.
Bye.